Hi, I'm Michelle Dixon, and welcome back to The Shattering Place, the podcast that explores the living science and true stories of multidimensionality in service to healing, awakening, and the evolution of consciousness. In previous episodes, we have faced the collective shadow and the death of the old world. We have acknowledged that the shattering that we see around us is a fierce evolutionary pressure. But as the outer world dissolves, our inner world must become more disciplined. As I mentioned last episode, you can't navigate a storm in a leaking boat. If you haven't yet listened to the previous episodes, I encourage you to do so. They provide the necessary context for what we're stepping into today. Today, we move into the seventh threshold, Ascension and Awakening, the discipline of embodiment. In this episode, we're going to talk about ascension or awakening and try to wrest back these terms, these words, both from religious and spiritual traditions and also from popular culture's 5D narratives. It may perhaps be a controversial way to discuss this topic, but I'm not holding back. Awakening or ascension should not be understood as an escape from human life or a relinquishing of our duties as humans. Nor should it be seen as a special experience reserved for a select few, and especially, it should not be sold to you as part of a pricey program. So then, what should it be? Awakening should be grounded in a radical act of embodiment. We'll explore today why pulling the infinite down into your cells is, first of all, a normal evolutionary process, but also one that requires a tight ship, a nervous system that's grounded and strong enough to carry the vastness of being. To understand ascension or awakening, we must first look at the high concept foundations of the contemplative traditions, Eastern traditions. These frameworks, including Zen Buddhism, Advaita Vedanta, and various mystical lineages, Sufism, for example, function less as religions and more as comprehensive philosophies or maps for living and for reaching oneness, the divine. These traditions remain vital today, represented by profound modern teachers like Adyashanti, who brings a Zen approach bridging to direct inquiry into the nature of self. It also includes the late Thich Nhat Hanh, whose engaged Buddhism brought the infinite into the simple act of breathing. You might be familiar with some of Thich Nhat Hanh's books. I'll put some in the show notes below. These traditions define awakening, traditionally known as enlightenment, but I'm mostly going to use the term awakening here. But they define it as a vertical shift in perception. You might recall how in my episode on the non-linearity of time, I use the vertical to describe a direct line to the infinite, in contrast with horizontal time, which is of the mundane world. In the vertical sense, then, awakening is a process of waking up from the dream or the illusion, often referred to as Maya in Vedic and Hindu traditions, waking up to realize the fundamental non duality of existence. Non duality meaning that reality is not separate, not strictly subject object, not dual, in other words. It's not two things or multiple things, but rather there is an inherent oneness that characterizes reality. This concept that we, you, me, the chair, that person, that tree, all of us and everything is connected and part of a larger consciousness. Put it another way, awakening is the lived recognition that the separate I is a construct and that our essential nature is the same consciousness that moves through all things. In this paradigm, enlightenment or awakening is a radical embodied experience of oneness. It is the moment when the boundaries of the ego, the self, the personality become porous. It's a realization that exists beyond language. It must be felt in the tissues and the marrow, and it really cannot be explained, only experienced, which is why so many spiritual masters teach in riddles and metaphors. They're teaching to trigger an experience in the student because there isn't a mental map they can simply hand someone. For centuries, humans have sought this state of enlightenment through highly structured communities and lineages, paths that provide a rigorous architecture for realization, utilizing ancient texts, specific methodologies to strip away the false self and trigger a moment of realization. Some examples include Vipassana, you might know as insight meditation, which is a kind of systematic way of self observation that dissolves the illusion of a permanent self. There's the koan practice of Zen, which uses paradoxical questions. You might have heard, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Meant to exhaust the analytical mind until it collapses, allowing a direct, non conceptual insight to rush in. There's Neti-Neti from Advaita Vedanta, which is an analytical process, not this, not that, where the seeker systematically peels away identifications with the body, the emotions, and the mind to reveal unchanging awareness. And then there's the Eightfold Path. It's like a complete ethical mental blueprint designed to harmonize the human life with the universal truth of interconnectedness. Just to give you a few examples of these traditions or paths to enlightenment. The other aspect of these traditional Eastern paths is that historically they require a total withdrawal from conventional society. To ascend out of the mundane, one had to enter closed communities, move to monasteries, submit to the absolute authority of a guru. The emphasis was almost entirely on leaving the human experience behind to find the divine. I've written about this a lot in the context of motherhood in my Substack publication, which I'll link below because mothers can't normally leave behind the children to find the divine, so we have to do it within that context. But in any case, as popular culture has taken an interest in these awakened states, awakening, enlightenment, the whole experience, the whole concept of awakening has moved into a secular and very commercialized space. We now see a proliferation of thought leaders promoting proprietary brands of enlightenment technologies. You've probably heard of a few, which I'm not going to name them, but in any case, I choose not to give much oxygen to these popular teachers for the reason that there's just for me too much exclusivity. All too often, these teachings sit behind a paywall, which suggests that evolution is a premium service that you have to pay for. And this is fundamentally problematic because awakening is a natural, biological, and evolutionary process which is accessible to every human being, as I will explore shortly. I mean, there is just so much wrong with this modern drive for awakening in this commercialized context. Awakening is not a hierarchical or morally derived achievement, it's a standard function of human maturation, as I will argue here. While programs can offer guidance, the experience itself is not something that can be purchased. In the past, the select few who pursued enlightenment or awakening were those who could afford to join a monastery, leave their life, and go live elsewhere. But today, those select few are those who can afford, high ticket spiritual retreats. The other thing that's wrong is this myth of the perfect master. We often see this persistent myth of the guru, the one, the idea that certain teachers possess a transmission so potent that they and only they alone can grant a direct experience of the divine through presence. Transmission here, transmission meaning a kind of emanation or energy that flows from the teacher and is able to shift the student's consciousness states. Much has been written on this. I know of direct experiences, but that's really outside of today's topic. It is the case that some teachers have very strong transmissions. Everyone has a transmission to a certain extent, and some have quite profound transmissions. But history shows that even those with such strong transmissions are not without human wounds and not without even toxic behaviors. We see the same loops of sex scandals and systematic manipulation in all kinds of closed systems, even in Eastern contemplative traditions, even amongst those who have those transmissions, which proves that a true teaching can still exist within a toxic architecture. My warning here is that when these advanced spiritual abilities and transmissions enter an unregulated marketplace, guardrails vanish and truth becomes another competitive product. This brings us to the Ascension or 5D movement, which is a subset of the New Age movement that has emerged from kind of an uncomfortable merging of personal development agendas with traditional awakening concepts. This rhetoric often mirrors specific sectarian beliefs, suggesting that a small minority of vibrational elites will transcend reality while the rest of us are left behind. For me, it infuses spiritual growth with a pseudo scientific lexicon using terms like, frequency shifting, 5D, 4D, but in any case, shifts the burden of awakening entirely onto the individual's effort. It suggests that awakening is a frequency. I have no problem with frequency in general, but this idea that awakening is a certain frequency that only a few select people can tune into through specific and often very expensive techniques. It also suggests that success with awakening is a matter of trying harder. It's mirroring so many of the hustle culture, work ethic, um, aspects of corporatism and capitalism that we've imported into spirituality and imply that, if you haven't transcended your current reality, it's a personal failure of your own vibration. This is meritocracy at its worst, right? If you're not happy or successful or awakened, then you obviously didn't you didn't do a very good job. And also, my problem is that the goal is an exit strategy. It's a way of bypassing the discomfort of 3D reality, of Earth, of life, of the shadow, as I discussed in the last episode, rather than as a way of inhabiting it. Because awakening is actually a way of inhabiting the world as it is. By framing evolution as a high tech upgrade rather than a natural biological unfolding, this movement creates a new kind of spiritual closed loop where the seeker is perpetually chasing a dimension that remains just out of reach. To move from the exclusive, often commercialized narrative of 5D ascension into a more grounded territory, we actually have to shift our gaze towards the empirical. Because, as I've suggested already, awakening isn't some sort of mystical upgrade. It's actually a biological mandate. A foundational truth in our modern worldview is that evolution is a constant, non negotiable process. We see this in the adaptation of species to their environments, the relentless trajectory of technology, and biological shifts in human design. There is no such thing as stasis. We are perpetually in a process of becoming. Awakening is an extension of this same evolutionary pressure. It's a process that plays out regardless of our preference or resistance. We can facilitate the transition, but we can't opt out of the evolution itself. This perspective anchors awakening in the innate human condition. It's a process that implicates the psyche and identity alongside biological mechanisms, which are only beginning to become categorized by thinkers and writers and philosophers. We see glimpses of this in concepts like morphic resonance, which I have spoken about a lot in earlier episodes, where a shift in one part of a species in one part of the world triggers a parallel change elsewhere, suggesting a genetic or energetic profile that morphs across the collective. This is the biological substrate of the awakening experience, a species wide recalibration that transcends the individual. While the biology remains a topic beyond my expertise, the evolution of the psyche is a territory I have mapped through years of working with humans deeply. This evolution centers on the ego structure. The ego is a natural developmental experience. We begin as infants with a tenuous sense of self grounded in the maternal gaze and the relational space, not even really having a sense of an I that is separate from mother, from our environment. Around the age of 2, we begin to perceive separation more clearly, invoking our own demands and differentiating the I from the world, those terrible 2s and 3-nagers. The thing is, an ego is a natural development because we can only mature and gain wisdom and even heal our traumas through our egos, through our personalities and identities. Different people throughout the modern era have explored and explained the ego in varying ways. Sigmund Freud, perhaps the best known, identified the ego as a necessary survival architecture. In the Freudian view, the ego is it's a fragile boundary caught between primal instincts and societal demands, and it functions as kind of a shield against the chaos of the world. So Carl Jung, on the other hand, expanded the ego into a more kind of multidimensional arena. He introduced the collective unconscious, of course, and archetypes. So he viewed the ego rather as a temple for symbolic expression. In the Jungian map, we evolve towards the self, a self with a capital S, a soul level integration of the shadow and the light. The ego is much broader and has more room for cultivation of something greater. Now, in real life, in the sort of developmental stages that all humans go through with the ego, there is inevitably a time when the ego structure, with all of its carefully constructed defenses and phobias, very Freudian, and strategies, when this becomes restrictive. For example, maybe you've built your ego, your personality, around being a certain kind of person. You identify as having a sunny personality, or you have a particular sense of self. Maybe it's related to your sense of humor, or your profession, or your style, or your family. But then one day you don't want to be that person anymore. You want to be different somehow. Your identity begins to feel like a suit of clothing that has been outgrown. And it is the case that the ego is very much an identity. It's an identity. Some people call it the small self, the self that's kind of been cultivated and developed and constructed over the lifetime. And it can be outgrown. This feeling that it needs to be outgrown, this cracking of the shell, is the first time perhaps the personality realizes that it's not the master of the house, but it's just a container. It's a fragile eggshell. When the ego structure becomes too small for the life force within it, the resulting pressure feels like a crisis, but it's actually the emergence of the soul. This is the architecture of the true self. What we're awakening to is a shift in the seat of our identity. We're awakening to some greater part of ourself beyond this ego structure. For most of our lives, we identify as the collection of roles, defenses, and histories that we are, and that's how we navigate the world through this person we think we are. Awakening is the experiential realization that you are consciousness, the consciousness in which the ego arises. So, to many, the soul is our essence, and it's currently experiencing life in a body, but the soul existed before and it will exist after death. But even without this spiritual understanding or this particular way of languaging it, we might describe the soul rather as a blueprint, as the unique, essential frequency of your being, the part of you that exists prior to trauma, for example, the part of you that is independent of your social conditioning. In other words, the part of you that might have existed as a child before something bad happened and before anyone had any expectations of who you should become. Sometimes I describe, instead of using the word soul, I describe it as the potential of your DNA, before life happened, before parts of you got shut down or went into hiding or didn't have a chance to express. When this part of you, this essential part of you, demands more space in your body, demands more space in your life, it's pushing for an alignment between your external life and your internal truth. But awakening is not just about a quality of soul experience, it's also a quality of interconnection to all of existence. It's not just, I want to be more than I am, or these identifications no longer fit. It's also a sense of, wow, I might have a interconnection to all of reality or to consciousness or to God in a way I haven't considered before, because beyond the individual soul lies the realization of non separation, the understanding that consciousness is not something you have, but something you are. In this state, the boundary between me and the world begins to soften. You become awake to a unity where the observer and the observed are revealed to be part of the same underlying reality. Put it another way, for those who have a more Western monotheistic view of spirituality, like Christianity. In this context, awakening is a very, very intimate realization of the presence of God, of the presence of the divine or the Holy Spirit in one's felt lived experience, experiencing that guiding hand beyond all. This is why the awakened experience eventually feels like the end of self help, for example, because self help is about the ego. Let's become better people. Awakening is, in contrast, about the soul. In an awakened state, rather than trying to improve a broken ego, you rest as wholeness, a wholeness that was never broken to begin with. In other words, the ego driven life is fueled by the fear of not enough, of comparison, even. The soul driven life is fueled by presence. To use my boat analogy, the tight ship analogy, you stop bailing water out of a leaking boat because you've realized that you are the ocean itself. In previous eras, as I've shared earlier, awakening was a specialized event reserved for those living outside the structures of conventional society. Today, this experience happens to everyday people. It probably always has. We probably just haven't spoken about it. This capacity is currently being activated across the collective more publicly. And so, because of that, we really need to shift the conversation from specialness to being informed and even prepared. But how can we prepare ourselves to shift out of an ego dominant state into a state that more closely resembles soul, more closely resembles being, more connected to the divine? Let's look to the Christian contemplative tradition to begin with, because this is often missed, this awakening to the divine that has been going on in all traditions across time. We often think that awakening is something that happens with enlightenment in the Eastern traditions, but in fact, the Christian contemplative tradition has a very rich history of this direct experience. It's a lineage that traces back to the 4th century so called desert mystics, men and women who fled the cities for the Egyptian and Syrian wilderness to seek a direct inner encounter with the divine. Over the centuries, this tradition evolved through the compassionate soul friending of 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich and the rigorous psychological mapping of, for example, the 16th century monk St. John of the Cross. In the 20th century, this ancient wisdom was brought into the modern world by Thomas Merton. I've mentioned him before, a Trappist monk who became the bridge between Eastern and Western contemplative practices. His contribution was really the democratization of the internal life, translating the deeply internal numinous experiences of the monastery into an accessible language for those living in the modern world. As for preparing for an awakening, Within the Christian contemplative tradition, there's a direct parallel to Eastern Enlightenment practices in the specific form of spiritual accompaniment or spiritual direction. So, while the language of awakening is, of course, often absent from traditional Christian discourse due to an inherent theological duality. So, in Eastern traditions, there's a oneness or a unity of consciousness, whereas in a Christian tradition, God is perceived as an external other. Nevertheless, there is a significant crossover in the mechanics of the journey. In both the non dual experience of consciousness as primary and the Christian experience of a relationship with God and the Holy Spirit, the path consists of nameable sequential shifts in perception. In spiritual accompaniment, one person accompanies another on a journey of deepening this relationship, focusing on the deliberate process of spiritual discernment, that is, discerning how the voice of God is communicating versus the voice of the ego, learning to understand and feel the difference. Like with a non dual awakening, this path leads an individual towards a refined internal sensitivity. And by that, I mean a nuanced ability to feel and experience the divine oneness, consciousness, however you name it. In a book called The Way of Discernment by Elizabeth Liebert, she talks about this Christian contemplative path of accompaniment. And she demonstrates that our capacity as humans to listen for the divine is a direct reflection of our developmental stage. Now, this is very interesting because, in her view, we move from a conformist stage where truth is external and a spiritual life is about following rules, group rules, the tribe, right? Into a reflective stage where we begin to own our own faith and evaluate our values through a personal lens. In Liebert's map, the journey culminates in an integrative stage. Here, the individual develops the capacity to hold mystery and contradiction. Discernment at this level has already moved beyond looking for that external validation, a yes or a no, guidance from the outside, and it becomes internal alignment with a sense of connectedness, interconnectedness. This both and thinking is the hallmark of the mature human. And here is where we land on common ground across these Eastern Western traditions. And of course, I haven't mentioned other traditions, I'm not mentioning everything. Um, I haven't gone into um, Islam or Sufism, but this is a good starting point to blend the East and the West to this extent across this divide of Christian mysticism and Eastern contemplative traditions. Whether the divine is perceived as out there or everywhere, the requirement is actually the same for awakening, for connection. The individual must grow into a structure, into a being capable of being sustained by the infinite. It's about this slow, nuanced cultivation of the capacity to hold the soul in the body. By hold, I mean to experience the fullness of it rather than living through the ego alone. The movement from the global democratization of awakening into the personal experience of it requires an examination of this individual trajectory through transformation. And this is where the theoretical constructs become deeply human. One of the honors of my work is the trust people place in me during their most vulnerable experiences. And through years of practice and training, especially in a group learning context where you move with a group through a process, I have witnessed the evolution of both individuals and groups in real time. In a space of stillness and love, there is an existential equality that replaces hierarchy. And through that equality, we can sense our interconnection. We can sense a shared consciousness. When we allow individuals to be exactly where they are without judgment, There is a gradual shedding of the constructs that once defined the ego. That shedding begins to occur and awakening naturally unfolds. I have observed a consistent pattern in this evolution. While these phases are not always linear, they illustrate a certain standard kind of journey, beginning with identification with the story, a stage at which the person, the I, is entirely fused with history, with pain. It's a valid and necessary part of the journey. We must own our suffering, our story, before we can move beyond it. But at some point, there comes a disentanglement and a catharsis, the realization that the story of one's life is not the full self. There is an I that cannot be defined by what happened. There is an I that cannot be defined by who I think I am. And this realization often triggers a somatic release. Tears, rage, profound allowing, followed by a cognitive reframing, a space that begins to open up between the self and the crisis. And then we enter kind of a phase 3 of no man's land where the old ego structure feels restrictive. Those external identifiers, career, relationships, previous ways of expressing oneself, they might no longer seem to fit. There is a period of profound uncertainty, of confusion. Who am I if I am not that story? Then a gentle engagement with a more soul based identity begins. And identity reorients itself away from previous definitions and towards something vast and interconnected. And in my experience, the outcome of this process is a state of fundamental wellness. It's a sense of alignment with wholeness, of a self that exists prior to ego or trauma. Even if there's still feeling, there's still a wellness there beneath it. The shift moves us away from a frantic need for self help or for constant seeking, and instead it fosters this new orientation towards innate strengths. We stop trying to fill gaps or fix what is broken and instead focus on what we're naturally drawn to. Awakening is the transition from a life of repair to a life of presence.
Removal of destructive habit. Body feels like body setting.
As the psyche moves, so the body must play catch up. This process often involves physiological symptoms, or what is often called Kundalini experiences, in which the nervous system recalibrates to handle the shifting consciousness. Whilst I won't dive deep into these specific rabbit holes in this episode, I will include resources like the work of Bonnie Greenwell in the show notes for those experiencing these physical shifts, which are well documented for millennia and also which are, in my experience, quite real and extremely disconcerting. The culmination of this process is actually radical embodiment. The old school monastic model focused on the ascent of of the consciousness out of human life. But what I have observed is the opposite. Awakening is about bringing the infinite back into the cells. When the old ego structures fall away, something much more vast takes up residence in the physical form, and not just space. There's a new orientation point. Reality becomes sharper, life tastes different, precisely because there is finally more of you in the body. And there is a new engine that drives one's existence. And you're not controlling it. Consciousness, God, the divine soul, that is now moving you through the world rather than the small ego of the small self. And I believe that this softness, this new orientation, this divinely guided existence and expanded self, this is precisely the shift required to navigate the shattering of the outer world with consciousness and fierce presence. Okay, so I have taken you through my own personal map. I haven't, however, shared the full personal experience I've had yet. I think I'll have to devote a future episode to that because I have to kind of prepare myself for that level of vulnerability. But Also, because I want to be very careful about how I speak about it personally, because it's very, very easy to misinterpret another person's journey as being somehow special or not what you yourself are capable of. And I want to transmit the exact opposite message. In fact, I want to say that I'm not special at all, that my life has unfolded in a way that has helped me become ready for certain changes. I've had some very good teachers, groups, and communities that have created kind of a scaffolding for this process, but I'll share more about that another time. For now, I want to emphasize again this concept of the discipline of embodiment. The foundational truth of this work, this awakening experience, is that your body is the vessel for your soul's journey. And I don't want to get too pedantic about it because it's not as simple as it may appear when I just state that it's the vessel for your soul's journey. It's kind of in a metaphorical sense that ship in which you're traveling through life, and more specifically, that ship is your nervous system. The metaphor works for me here because for me, awakening is an inevitable merging of this infinite into the finite of the body, specifically the nervous system. And pulling the infinite down into your cells requires this tight ship, as I've mentioned before, a physiological architecture capable of holding high voltage multidimensionality without burning out. And my mission here is not to engage in magical thinking or to suggest that wiring your body in a specific way is going to turn you into an all-seeing psychic master. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's the future of humanity. It's not really my area, but I hold the phenomenology of these states lightly. I name them to illustrate possibility, to illustrate the reality of our potential. But providing a formula to reach those states isn't the goal of this podcast. There are plenty of teachers who can offer you that. Because in truth, for me, there is no formula. I'm interested in the reality of your personal evolution and how that maps onto the collective. However, as we focus on the strength of this vessel, this nervous system, we must inevitably confront the weight of the cargo it carries. So, extending the metaphor to trauma, in my work, I often speak to clients about the stones they carry in their backpacks. Each stone represents a hurt, a trauma, a grievance they carry. Part of our work together, to be metaphorical and also very general, is to move towards a laying down of those burdens, to lighten the load. And this, dear listeners, brings us to the essential role of suffering, because suffering is part of the human journey and it's equally part of the awakening journey. I refuse to engage in spiritual bypassing. We must become intimately familiar with our own burdens just as clearly as we name those shadows in the collective. The first precept of Buddhism states that life is suffering. While many contemplative traditions and popular narratives suggest that suffering is merely resistance to what is, this is only a partial truth. Often, suffering is indeed a resistance to being with the reality of circumstances we may not like, but have to live anyway. Suffering, though, is also the holy act of grieving for the finality of what we have lost. It's the collapse of identities, the ending of circumstances, the reality of loss. Life doesn't cease being life, even when there has been this fundamental shift in being called awakening. It's it's not the cessation of suffering. It's a shift in wherein we locate ourselves in relation to that suffering. It's a reorientation of how we experience our own center amidst the storm. There is, in my experience, a kind of suffering that exists within fertile joy, within a grounded peace. There is pain and there is bliss simultaneously, a kind of sharp nostalgia for wholeness that collapses duality. There is human pain and there is the bliss of feeling familiar, and unending intimacy with the divine. In many ways, the awakened person feels more, not less. They no longer feel only their personal or intergenerational pain. They feel the acute grief of the collective, such as grief for the environmental collapse that Joanna Macy described. Here's the thing: feeling the suffering of the world is not a sign of weakness or a lack of embodiment. It's the hallmark of a nervous system capable of feeling the whole. For this reason, we must become disciplined in our refusal to judge another's path or make assumptions about someone else's process based on their proximity to pain. I named my publication, my Substack publication, Growing Up, Waking Up, because these two processes, growing up and waking up, are the twin engines of this new human. Through the lens of Ken Wilber's integral theory, we see that these are distinct yet inseparable trajectories. Waking up is the vertical ascent. It's a shift from ego identification to the vastness of consciousness, which I call the still point. Growing up is a horizontal development. It's the gritty psychological work of maturing emotional intelligence, cleaning our shadows, refining our ethics. The primary danger of the modern spiritual landscape is the guru scandal kind of archetype, individuals with powerful transmissions, access to the divine, who possess fractured vessels. These are people who have woken up to the infinite, but they've not grown up out of their narcissistic wounding. When you pour infinite power into a cracked vessel, the leaks are devastating. So, to navigate the shattering towards awakening, we must commit to both the expansion of consciousness and the rigorous maturity of our humanness. So, what might growing up look like if we're not going to take on board the enormous topic of what it means to heal wounds or understand ourselves better through therapy? I would say that individual maturity begins with the stabilization of the nervous system and the radical ownership of the psyche. This is the starting point for moving beyond the theoretical and into the lived reality of being grounded, taking responsibility for thoughts, the mind, and behavior initiates the transition into the somatic territory of groundedness, of stabilization. From this state of stabilized self knowing, the burden of the past lightens. This creates the capacity to move towards sustained inner peace. This movement leads directly to the practice of forgiveness. In A Course in Miracles, forgiveness is a profound letting go of grasping that keeps the ego tight and defensive. When you stop grasping at your hurts or clutching your resentments, the tight ship of your nervous system finally stops bailing water and becomes buoyant. Forgiveness is fundamentally a somatic event. When your physiology finally adapts to the infinite by letting go of the internal contraction of blame, you can become a lighthouse, a signal to others. A lighthouse doesn't run around the beach trying to rescue people. It simply stands its ground and emits a frequency that guides others through the storm. This is the power of a regulated, embodied presence. And this is where I draw a firm line between the still point, this groundedness I describe, and the popular narratives of 5D and DNA upgrades. There is no exit strategy from the human mess of hardship and suffering. Growing up is the vital, mandatory downward movement of awakening. It is the willingness to look at the shadow, the ancestral trauma, and the systemic shattering without flinching. You can't ascend out of a body you haven't fully inhabited. There are no shortcuts through DNA activations that bypass the hard work of psychological maturity. If your 5D frequency doesn't make you a kinder, more integrated, and more responsible human in this dimension, it's dissociation. We don't wake up to leave, we wake up to arrive. Okay, we've reached the end, my friends, and in this episode, we've taken the words awakening and ascension back, extracting them from exclusive traditions and systems, specialness, and paywalls, and returning them to their rightful place in human evolution. We've reframed awakening as a profound descent into ourselves. The tight ship of the nervous system is the only vessel capable of holding this high voltage resonance of the infinite. We've moved from being passive observers to becoming the master craftsmen of our own somatic groundedness. Once the vessel is strong enough to hold the light, the purpose of that strength is clear. A vessel exists to carry a message. And in our next episode, the illuminated manuscript, we return to the idea of the transmission. But this time, the manuscript isn't just a book, even not just a book like mine, IKONA. In this episode, you are the manuscript, you are the transmission. The ink is your own integrated shadow, and your transmission or frequency is the result of a nervous system finally being able to hold the light without shattering. We're going to explore what it looks like to live your daily life as a healing transmission for others. We'll dive into the discovery that every action, word, and thought is a multidimensional event that ripples through the collective field. And I'm going to ask you, what frequency are you currently illuminating for the world? We'll meet again soon at the edges of the known. Quickly, a word about working with me one-on-one. While my traditional clinical practice is currently at capacity, I do have a few spots available every month for my 90-day structural recalibration, which sits entirely outside of the traditional model, allowing me to bring my full multidimensional toolkit from somatic, neural rewiring to evolutionary astrology to bring it directly into your process. If you're ready to move beyond the baseline into your own evolutionary healing and mission, it's called the 90-day structural recalibration, and there are links to apply for it in the show notes below. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please do give it a star rating and even better, a review. And come and find me on my Substack or on my IKONA website. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And you will hear from me again next week.